Hi, in this lecture, I'm going to conclude our look at Neo-Confucian philosophy by comparing Wang Yongming and Zhu Xi. And in the process, we'll see a few more details about what Wang thinks the process of self-cultivation consists in. Wang Yongming is perhaps most famous for his doctrine of the unity of knowing and acting. Although, as we'll see, it might be a misnomer to call it a doctrine. So what Wang says is that those who know, or are said to know, but do not act, simply do not yet know. That is to say, you need to act, you need to do something with what you presume to know in order to actually count as knowing. So recall that point earlier about needing to have the experience. Some experiences you have through doing things. In fact, Wang uses this idea to interpret some passages in the Great Learning. For example, there's that puzzling passage where it says that sincerity in avoiding self-deception is like loving a lovely sight or hating a hateful odor. So with that passage, Wang says, quote, seeing a lovely sight is a case of knowing, while loving a lovely sight is a case of acting. Notice, seeing is just this detached observer perspective, whereas loving involves a feeling, involves an experience, and so that can amount to a case of acting. So Wang's understanding of what acting amounts to is quite broad. Now, why is all this important? Well, it's because it unifies your thought and your action. It makes you one integral whole. And that leads us to how Wang responds to the problem of weakness of the will. So recall that Zhu Xi says that we can have weakness of the will because we can have knowledge but fail to act on it. And Zhu further says that this is explained by self-deception that is rooted by selfish desires, that we use rationalizations, for example, to help us carry out selfish behavior and avoid what we already know ought to be done. Zhu further says that we overcome weakness of the will and self-deception by exerting effort and paying reverential attention to what needs to be done. And this is all rooted in his thought in intellectual investigation. Wang, on the other hand, thinks that you can't have knowledge but fail to act on it. So he, in other words, denies the phenomenon of weakness of the will, that you can't really have a will that is too weak to do what is already known. Rather, his point is, if someone doesn't do something, that means that they don't really have full knowledge to begin with. So Wang doesn't really emphasize something like self-deception. He rather emphasizes that the problem here is a failure to act. It's a problem of being lazy, essentially. And you are lazy because you have these selfish desires. And so what you need to do is just exert your will. So that's shared with Zhu Xi, but you also need to get the right perspective on things. Taking the right perspective, as in the case of the child about to fall in the well, that you see yourself as one with the child. And so you overcome selfishness by overcoming a selfish perspective. So you'll note here that there are a lot of similarities actually between Zhu Xi and Wang Yongming, that they both recognize the importance of using effort. But the ultimate difference between the two is that Zhu Xi emphasizes the need for intellectual knowledge, whereas Wang Yongming emphasizes the need for getting a right perspective on what needs to be done. Now, to think further about how much and whether Zhu and Wang disagree, it will be helpful to consider what Wang Yongming says about his own teachings. Wang said that sages and worthies teach in the same way that physicians prescribe medicine. So what's that? Well, to match treatment to ailment. So you can't heal someone by using just one medicine that you give to everyone. Likewise, you can't help someone become cultivated by using just one method, one course of action. Rather, you need to identify the problems that each particular person faces and do what is appropriate. Now, what does all this mean? Well, it means that Wang's approach is a therapeutic approach. He doesn't adopt dogmas, principles that hold to universally, but each case might be different. And so that's the kind of perspective that we need to take in thinking about self-cultivation. Now, this therapeutic approach is exemplified by a certain doctrine, what might be called a doctrine of Wang's, the doctrine of the unity of knowing and acting. This therapeutic approach, furthermore, applies to this idea that knowing and acting are a unity. But recall that Wang's approach is a therapeutic approach. And so this doctrine of the unity of knowledge and action is not so much a doctrine, but rather something to be given to certain people that need it. And so in an extended passage that I provide on the slide, he basically explains that for some people, they need to engage in intellectual investigation first because that's suitable for them, because they're the sort of person that's going to act, but act foolishly, irresponsibly, and so they need to reflect and think about things more than they do. But Wang emphasizes that there are people that are different from that. There are some people that are too bookish, that are just going to study and don't act when they need to. And so he's saying that this unity of knowing and acting means that you need to do both things. And different people are going to need to compensate differently depending on their natural predilections. So to conclude, this therapeutic approach shows that Wang is not so much in disagreement with Zhu, but rather he thinks we need to be more nuanced in the type of advice that we give, the type of things that we need to do in order to be successful in the process of self-cultivation.